everyone who's joining us today from around the world to this panel in the Gobeshona Global Conference. It's really exciting to get to do this with everyone here because we have both a global audience and also a global set of panelists here as well. This session will be focused around community-driven energy resources and energy justice, and we'll get several different perspectives on what I think are really new and powerful initiatives in this area. And so I'm looking forward both to the panelists talking to all of us, panels talking to each other, and then some dialogue back and forth at the end in terms of some of these sorts of solutions. So I'm a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley, where I'm the chair of something called the Energy and Resources Group. I'm also a faculty in the Goldman School of Public Policy and the Department of Nuclear Engineering. But I think the most exciting and important part of this is that I get to work with not only our three panelists, but also a current graduate student, Samira Siddiqui, who's done an incredible job in setting up this panel. So I'll introduce the panelists in the order they're going to speak. And I think you'll see from that immediately the kind of the interesting range of activities and things we'll get to talk about today. So first we'll hear from Dr. Rebeka Shirley. She is the Director of Research and Data and Innovation at the World Resources Institute. And she comes to that position fairly recently after a really interesting career as the Director of Research for Power for All, as well as a partner at the Strathmore University in Nairobi, where she lives, and in particular with the Strathmore Energy Research Center, working on a range of projects around community empowerment, energy choices, and the transition to sustainability. Dr. Sebastion Groh, who received his PhD in Germany, has not only worked on research issues around energy access, but perhaps most immediate to some of the participants here is the managing director of SOLshare. And this is an effort to not only bring direct power through a Hive-based mini-grid effort, but also a key financial institution in terms of investing in energy access worldwide. It's a real pleasure to have Sebastion and Rebeka on. And our last panelist will be Dave Mozersky, who I've had the pleasure to work with both here at Berkeley, but in particular in the field. And Dave is the president and the co-founder of Energy Peace Partners, which I'm hoping for those of you who haven't heard about it before are going to really get an interesting deep dive today in terms of not only finding ways to build community-based clean energy systems in some of the most challenging, most complex parts of the world, but also a novel new funding mechanism, a so-called peace credit, a PREC as it's called, Peace Renewable Energy Credit, that allows funders of all types to invest in this area. And so just from that, I hope you get a feeling for the focus we'll get today on innovation, on direct community partnership, on providing energy access solutions, and in particular on how all of these fill the critical needs around energy justice, both setting up just institutions and also restorative forms of justice for our underinvestments everywhere. And so again, I can't wait to hear them all speak. I also am looking at some of the people who are participating, colleagues around the world, and so we'll get into that dialogue. But let me first hand it over to Dr. Rebeka Shirley. And again, thanks to all of our panelists, thanks to Samira Siddiqui, thanks to the managers at Gobeshona for setting this up and for letting us be part of this global rolling around the planet dialogue on this day of justice and restoration in the United States when we launch a new president committed to these goals. So thanks all of our panelists. Rebeka, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks good.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much, Dan, as I mentioned, and thank you to the ICCC team for having me. I'm Rebeka Shirley, as Dan said, and I work at WRI, which is a think and do tank focused on the intersection between the environment and development. So this topic today is really near and dear to my heart. And as I understand, this week and today in particular, the entire conference is really focused on energy, or the linkages between energy and climate justice. Energy resources are the dominant source of greenhouse gas emissions, of course, so we are all naturally invested in a smart energy future. But today I want to talk about something that might be a little bit less obvious, and that is the global interlinkages of energy and climate justice to the African energy landscape. The continent really consumes very little energy and contributes few emissions relative to other continents. So it's not a much talked about subject. But today I want to unpack that a bit and explain how this landscape is changing and why it's important for our clean energy transition, if it's going to be just, inclusive, and equitable, to make sure that Africa is included. So as we all know, world population is expanding rapidly and is projected to increase from today's 7.8 billion to 9.9 billion by 2050, an increase of more than 25%. But according to the UN, Africa's population, the fastest growing and youngest in the world, is largely driving this trend, as you can see here. In fact, 1 in 2 people added to the world's population between today and 2040 will be African, and the continent becomes the world's most populous region before the end of this decade, overtaking China and India. Much of this growth will be in urban centers, so how Africa meets its growing energy needs is crucial to the continent's economic and energy future, but also has global consequences. So it's important that this region not be left behind the curve. Let's understand why. By 2040, growing urban populations will more than double Africa's energy demand, needed for industrial production, agriculture, heating, cooling, cooking, and mobility. And Africa is now emerging as a major force in global oil and gas markets. The projected growth in Africa's oil demand over the next 2 decades is higher than that of China and second only to India, as you can see here. This is largely as the size of Africa's car fleet more than doubles, and as liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, is increasingly used for clean cooking. Africa will also become the 3rd largest source of global gas demand growth over the same period. So shifting Africa to a clean energy future is quietly becoming a major national and foreign policy discussion. But the policies thus far tend to focus on increasing installed renewable energy capacity, which is a gross oversimplification of the challenge. Let's unpack that a bit. And by the end, I think you're going to understand why Africa is directly connected to a just climate future. We start here with transportation. It's impossible to overstate the linkage between energy and transportation in Africa, because that growing car demand that we talked about in the last slide is being served by millions of substandard vehicles exported every year from Europe, the United States, and Japan. Africa alone accounts for over 40% of used vehicle exports. So the entire motorization of Africa is taking place based on old technology, low efficiency internal combustion engine imported vehicles. And according to the EIA, energy consumption from fuel for vehicles could actually match electricity consumption by 2040 if left unchecked. And few African countries have vehicle emission standards like emissions-based taxes, especially given the lack of global emissions regulations. So you see, if the rest of the world moves on to electric solutions for mobility, all the while dumping used vehicles in Africa to continue running, we're going to lose some of those gains. And it affects our ability to reach global emissions targets. It also sets Africa onto a transportation path into the future that's based on old technology. So my research right now is starting to explore some of the opportunities where, despite such poor reliability, African grids could perhaps support electric vehicle fleets and electric public transit. As you can see on the left-hand side, what we're doing with our research, which focuses on Nairobi in Kenya here, where I'm calling in from, we're trying to understand, this is a map of Nairobi, and we're trying to understand where exactly, if there were different levels of fleet conversion, would that demand be? And on the right, as you can see, once we know where the demand is and the characteristics of that demand, we can generate charging profiles. Once we have charging profiles, we can understand better what's the trade-off, what's the play between the grid and the fleet, and help to optimize that relationship. This type of research, I can talk about more in the Q&A, but is desperately needed if we're going to drive Africa into the right direction in terms of energy and transportation. On the other hand of the spectrum sits agriculture, a sector that has traditionally had very little linkage to energy in Africa. Because despite being by far the largest employer and contributor to African GDP, over 85% of the continent's output is produced by smallholder farmers, more than 75% of them using hand tools only. Moreover, post-harvest value addition, activities like milling or canning, oil pressing, and so on, usually a major employer and revenue earner in developed agrarian economies, as you can see on the left, are largely absent in Africa, given historical global trade agreements, local politics. It all keeps African countries at the bottom left-hand corner of this graph. So as nations begin to prioritize improving farm productivity and value addition, agricultural demand will double, as you see on the right. But in the absence of access to low-cost, reliable power, that demand is now being served by small, private diesel generation. In many countries here, like Nigeria or Congo, diesel generator capacity is actually greater than the capacity of grid-connected power plants. So, if clean energy policy and our clean energy transition misses the mark on accessibility of power, then Africa's largest sector could be stymied, spelling unemployment, food insecurity, and humanitarian challenges of global proportion. So this is one area where we're trying to do some research as well. As you can see on these graphs, or these maps rather, on the left and on the right, we've overlaid data sets of what do you call yield, maize yield, and we've done this for many other crops, including rice, beans, and so on. We've overlaid maize yield with projections on where grid infrastructure of different types and categorizations is going to sit or exist by 2030. By overlaying these data sets and layering on top of them, sort of like a cake, other data sets, including climate projections like precipitation, transportation, and others, what we can begin to understand is where there is high impact opportunity for electricity access to support improving yields of different types of crops. To fill the gap, though, on energy access, what we're seeing is a new wave of small-scale renewable energy enterprises emerging, from renewable energy-based fruit drying to milling, oil pressing, egg incubation, cold storage, and more. Our research is showing that decentralized renewable energy technologies like mini-grids or solar home systems, which allow power for these activities to be generated near the demand, bring a host of efficiency gains. So these markets are accelerating rapidly in countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. As of today, millions of solar systems have been sold. Over 4,000 mini-grids are under construction, and over a third of sub-Saharan African countries have official decentralized energy targets. In fact, the IEA projects on the left that while grid extension and densification is the least cost option for much of the population gaining access by 2030, over 50% of new connections would actually be best served, meaning least cost, by decentralized technologies. And what's more, our research is showing that these new decentralized technologies are creating thousands of jobs through direct employment and 5 times as many through productive applications of energy, like agricultural value addition, as you can see on the right. So new energy solutions are showing us a glimmer of what a different path for Africa could look like. So when we look at the energy landscape from different angles, we realize how interconnected these threads are. The economy, work, jobs, food security, mobility, energy, justice, and climate. The clean energy challenge is to improve infrastructure for industrial, agricultural, commercial, and transportation use, to innovate, stimulate, and support demand, and to ensure that this infrastructure is accessible, not just physically, but financially also, especially by poor communities, which historically have not been a priority for electrification. This will require not just more infrastructure, but fundamentally a change in the way we think about infrastructure altogether, an evolution of the traditional utility model to integrate these more flexible service products and partners. Another research exercise that I ran called Utilities 2.0 does exactly that. With the Ugandan utility, small-scale energy providers, and donors, we're exploring how decentralized and centralized energy technologies can actually work together to improve access. This is an exciting area of much-needed research, and I can talk about that more during the Q&A. But lastly, another reason why Africa's energy landscape has global ramifications for energy futures is that Africa is home to many of the mineral resources that are critical in driving global energy transitions. The DRC accounts for 2/3 of global cobalt production, and South Africa produces 70% of the world's platinum, as you can see here. Failure to keep up with the rising demand could not only hamper Africa's economic opportunities, but also could hold back the pace of global energy transitions. This could be an opportunity for minerals-rich countries. However, Africa's mining is currently a very unregulated sector, rampant with, of course, as we all know, child labor, wage exploitation, and a host of environmental impacts, including water contamination, deforestation, and air pollution. Likewise, the very same solar products that we just spoke about are adding to the e-waste challenge as well. As solar energy booms, so do expired lead-acid batteries for rooftop solar panels and lithium batteries for solar lamps. Africa is not a large producer of e-waste, as you can see on the right, but every year over 50 million tons of electronic waste is produced globally, and it's estimated that 80% of that ends up between Africa and Asia, often illegally. This will grow as we become more renewable and electric. And e-waste, of course, has several detrimental impacts on groundwater, air pollution, food contamination, and more, especially for the hundreds of thousands who scavenge recyclable materials by hand. So these are clearly pending environmental justice disasters of their own global proportion. So therefore, we really need to focus on urgent, responsible stewardship of these resources so that we don't create other challenges for ourselves trying to solve the ones that we have on our plate right now. Robust regulatory and oversight mechanisms will definitely help to ensure that revenues from mining produce visible positive results for local communities, and that solar products on the market are meeting minimum standards, that negative impacts on the environment from mining and waste disposal are all minimized. So let me end here. We've explored why Africa's clean energy transition is important, and we've broken clean energy down to see that clean means more than renewable, and energy means more than just increasing grid-based electricity. Climate change, the energy transition, justice, food security, livelihoods, and the economy, all individual SDGs on their own, are inherently intertwined. Thanks to resource endowments and technology improvements, Africa could be the first continent to grow its economy on a low carbon foundation, leading the way for future generations. The challenge of unlocking this transition are many, as you can see listed here, but they are also the opportunity. With stronger policy, clearer regulation, leadership from regional and national institutions that understand these intersectionalities, diverse financing options from donors, banks, and investors, and critical research, of course, to inform all of the above, we could be on the way to unlock these markets so that the future of energy for Africa and the world is widespread, accessible, affordable, environmentally responsible, and just. So thank you so much for your time. I hope this gives you each a bit of insight to walk away with and primes the discussion that we're going to have after the other panelists. Dan, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks so much. Rebeka, I really want to, can you hear me?
Yep.
Very good. I want to thank you for that. I suspect that many people were not aware, not only of the potential for this decentralized ag-based production, but also simply the sheer number of mini grids that are in operation in Africa already. It's kind of a unique resource. It's a learning platform. And as you say, it's a tool for the kind of justice we'll be talking about. So I'd like to pass this over to Dr. Sebastion Groh, who will give us a perspective not only on how they've grown a version of this in Bangladesh, but how, in addition, they've really become a hub of investing in innovative solutions as well. It's a really remarkable story. And Sebastion, let me pass it directly to you.
Unmuting helps. Thanks a lot, Dan. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Rebeka. I was startled by some of the things you just said, and you see, I coined this slide, "The future of energy begins with Bangladesh," and it could equally, mean the future of energy begins with Kenya. And the need for that, I think, was very clear by the statistics you presented with the used vehicles. We all talk about the Teslas of this world, but that helps very little if everything of the combustion engines goes to Africa and innovation doesn't happen there. I think that was a very, very startling image, but also can, of course, very much resonate with your image of utilities 2.0 or the utilities of the future. And I think that's where I would like to And these two things would like to set in a little bit from the perspective here in Bangladesh. We often say necessity is the mother of invention, or in our session team's case, it would be scarcity probably. And I would like to chime in a little bit of that. In respect to energy justice or injustice, what I'm going to cover more is the topic of energy poverty, or putting it in numbers, the 3.5 billion people around the globe who today have or don't have a reasonably reliable access to electricity service. It's a little bit wobbly, that definition of reasonably reliable, but it's purposely like that because then you see the extent of 3.5 billion people. Now I have a lot of echo here.
Sebastion,
can someone stop the echo? That would be awesome. Yeah.
Peculiar.
Test.
Yeah, we should test it.
Okay, I'll just continue. I have a lot of echo, but I'll just continue in that case. Is it clear on your side, or is it on my side like that? All right, I'll continue. So I'll just check what it is. It's better now. Okay, perfect. Thanks. So energy poverty would then be one dimension of an energy injustice, as it clearly fails to give everyone an equal shot at energy access. And in the spirit of the later discussions, I'd like to bring up some questions with that. When we talk about those solar home systems you see here being installed in the background, or mini grids or electricity grids, the question comes up: should electricity cost the same for any citizen? And I think we've recently seen some dynamics there in Tanzania. There's a lot of talk, or not only talk, is by now legal regulations on a national uniform tariff, which brings then some of the private sector companies or mini grid developers to the brink of bankruptcy, or even to bankruptcy. Now, the question is, what are the subsidies in place? Is electricity a merit good, and to what extent is it considered as a merit good? And we have similar voices here in Bangladesh that every Bangladeshi should pay the same price for electricity, which from an energy justice perspective, I think seems very fair. What people often forget is the subsidies which are going into the electricity grid, the subsidies which go into fossil fuels, which oftentimes are not that visible, because often those companies are public, and if they are incurring a loss on their balance sheets, this is kind of hidden. So the comparison between then a public infrastructure and private sector players coming in to support this fight against energy poverty becomes very quickly very, very complex. I just wanted to open that frame a little bit to that we may want to reflect on what that means if we have a viability gap financing need of an energy access provider. If you want to say, okay, look, everybody should pay a highly subsidized tariff because this will ensure affordability for everyone in the country, irrespective whether you come from an urban or a rural area. Moving on to come to Bangladesh, I came here about 7 years ago back then as a PhD student. What motivated me was that Bangladesh had the world's largest solar home system installation base. It's today about 6 million solar home systems. That means 30 million people have solar as their primary energy source, which is a world record. 6 million systems is massive. Depending how we define a solar home system, it's probably more systems than all other countries combined. It has also the highest population density in the world. except for the city-states. And thirdly, and that was very strongly accelerated through COVID. Actually, it has the biggest mobile money market in the world by now. I know, Rebeka, that M-Pesa is also very strong, but the latest numbers I found is that Bcash here and others have a bigger size in terms of how much money and how much outreach there is in the portfolio in Bangladesh. But be that as it may, as a strong mobile money market. Now, those three things we at SOLshare have actually motivated us to come up with something. Because you might say, okay, if there's the biggest solar home system base in Bangladesh, so what is the problem then? The problem we found is that whenever we went into those houses with those solar home systems, that at about 3 p.m., the batteries were all full, but the sun was still shining for a couple of hours. So we were asking, so what happens with all of that energy? And it was, well, the battery is full, no? So the battery will be locked by the charge controller, and the rest goes completely unused. We did this exercise that we put data loggers throughout the country, and we tried to calculate how much that would end up to be. And it was astonishing. We got to a number which is around $1 billion, which is the amount or the value of energy which goes completely wasted or unused. So we said, if we have $1 billion lying on those streets here and nobody is being able to capture it, can we come up with a way to tap into that potential and make it available to those villages? And that led us to the following setup, that we said, okay, we have houses who have at times too much energy, and we have a lot of houses who don't have anything. And then again, we have other houses who sometimes need more and sometimes need less energy. So what you can see in this little animation here is a peer-to-peer solar microgrid, which means that you start connecting one house with a panel with a house without, which happened before. People were throwing their cables over to their neighbors and then watching them at night through the window and seeing, okay, look, last night you spent 3 hours of your light was on, so please give me 15 cents. So we saw this happening already. So obviously we didn't invent energy sharing, neither an Uber probably invented giving someone a ride. But we tried to systemize it. We tried to build a platform around it. We integrated all the electricity meters. You can see here our meter, for instance, the so-called SOL box. We integrated them with mobile money, so that essentially on your meter, you no longer see kilowatt hours, but you see taka, which is the local currency here. So you may wake up with 100 taka on your meter, and then you go to work on your system starts to the sun starts shining and your system starts operating, and then it automatically sells. And when you come back in the evening, you may have 100 taka. The system also learns, so that when you come back in the evening, your battery is not empty because you have sold everything. So there's some intelligence in the system. Every meter here is an IoT device, so that we can see what's happening in the grid. We can learn how electrons should flow between those houses. And the key, I think, here is that you have a certain synergy effect. If you put solar home systems together, you get more than the sum of its parts, which means you can suddenly charge more things than you could before. A solar home system often is considered an energy access of maybe tier 1 or tier 2, which, to translate this a little bit in terms of appliances, you can charge your phone, you can have light, you can have a fan and possibly TV. But then it's getting a little bit tricky with fridges, with agricultural appliances, or you may have noticed this little rickshaw here. There's also 1.5 million electric vehicles, or as we call them, local Teslas here in Bangladesh, which is basically rickshaws, which run on batteries. Those also need to charge somewhere. And often they go through our grids in the afternoon to have their lunch or their tea, and then we offer basically a pit stop. Remember that 3-4 p.m. was when the batteries were full. Perfect time to charge a rickshaw. So that the rickshaw driver then in the evening can go an hour longer or can do another round during the afternoon, a longer route, whatever the point be there. This is essentially what SOLshare does as a platform to allow electricity exchange, in this case, solar electricity exchange, because the solar home systems are so abundant here. And the question, I put it out that, you know, the future of energy begins with Bangladesh. Why am I saying this? It's the question mark, is it a huge leapfrogging? Rebeka told us a little bit about utilities 2.0, the future of utilities. Maya here in the picture is a picture I took in 2015. She was the world's first prosumer. She was interconnected with her neighbors. Her system started selling electricity automatically. She got the money on her phone, and that was basically the first peer-to-peer grid in the world. A few weeks later, probably many here know, there came the Brooklyn grid in New York. So it may be a large leapfrog, and if we extrapolate this a little bit, we often talk about these 5 Ds of the energy future, and Maya here incorporates a lot of those 5 Ds. If we have a look at them, you have digitalization. The digitalization in her case is that her meter is connected to her mobile phone, and this is for her at the same time the clearing, where she can earn money or just top it up to have more energy credits, like a prepaid phone. It is definitely a disruption, because if we extrapolate the situation a little bit, if in a not so distant future, everybody has solar on their roofs and everybody has batteries in their houses, everybody gets interconnected, the question will be, what is the future role really of the traditional energy utility? Do I still need to build large power plants in places where the electricity is actually not being consumed? Definitely not to the extent we have it now. So it's definitely a disruption if you extrapolate a model a little bit, that we become more and more independent of these large-scale infrastructures. It's highly decentralized, as you can see in the background. For me, it's the same picture as this picture you can see in terms of the PV is decentralized, the batteries are decentralized. It's decarbonized through solar, but maybe what is not so much talked about, it's highly democratized, because you turn from a passive consumer really into a proactive, what we call prosumer, so some hybrid form of a producer and a consumer, depending on your own energy efficiency, behavior, or setup, depending on how much you can generate and store. So I think those 5 Ds, which we always talk about as the future of energy, they're already here, and I think we'll hear, or we heard from Rebeka, and we'll hear more in this panel, also in other countries. So sometimes the future is not that far away, but we already have it. The question is, how can we accelerate what we already have there? I would stop there and would ask a little bit in terms of energy justice of the 5 Ds. We often talk about disruptions and changes, when the internet came, when blockchain came, and the question is always, will it strengthen, a democratization of things, or will it centralize power even more? I think often we get disappointed. So my question out here for the panel, but possibly also for the audience, would also be, with these 5 Ds, with this advent of them, does it strengthen energy justice, or will we again go into a loop and it will again kind of monopolize, and power will again be centralized? I think that's a big question, and would be happy to discuss this further. And I'll stop here then and pass it back to you. Thank you very much.
Well, Sebastion, thanks so much. And thanks for giving the kind of the deep dive into how SOLshare works. I mean, I think not only is it a fascinating example of, as you say, democratizing energy, but also this issue that, will this path continue? i.e., will we build more and more decentralized, democratic, peer-to-peer institutions, or will this be something that ultimately gets captured? It's something we've seen in the launch of IT. After all, even Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, they were working in a garage in Albuquerque before, thinking they would be small disruptors until they became the opposite. And we wonder the same thing about Tesla and about VW. So this is really a critical question where technology opens the door, but doesn't answer the question. So I'm looking forward to doing more on that in a bit. And there's a quote that we often use on this, and that is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think really this is the core question. It's not one of will the hardware enable it? It's will our institutions, will our social fabric push us towards a situation where the richest and the poorest rooftops all have equal access to a clean energy market? Or is it one where we'll push one way or the other? And so I'm looking forward to people getting in on that. But before we get to that sort of bigger dialogue, I'm just really thrilled to bring Dave Mozersky in, because what he and Energy Peace Partners has done, and I should say with full disclosure, I'm on the board, so I am more than just a passive observer, but in terms of thinking about brand new mechanisms to make these clean energy technologies tools for not just democracy, but also for justice in areas that are under extreme conflict. This is a really important example. And so Dave, I'm just delighted to get everyone to hear from what you're doing, but also to highlight the degree to which we're now having a dialogue where Rebeka has talked in some level about kind of thinking differently about the settled systems that we have, how agriculture can be done differently to provide energy sources, how we can think about African cities as hubs of electric vehicles and new innovation, to Sebastian's approach to thinking about how the communities that we typically ignore and look away from actually could be the hubs of this. I had no idea Maya was the first prosumer in the world, for example, to what Dave will now do to talk about the areas that we look at in some sense the least. We pretend that people on the margins are not citizens of any country. In fact, Samira Siddiqui's work has highlighted very clearly the degree to which we deny human rights to those people who live in nationless or borderless or conflicted areas. And so what Dave and Energy Peace Partners are doing is taking on this question in an entirely new way. So Dave, let me pass it to you. And I thank you all for doing this.
Thank you very much, Dan. And it's a pleasure to follow on Rebeka and Sebastian's presentation. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Sorry. Okay, so as mentioned, I work with an organization called Energy Peace Partners, and what I think is slightly different about EPP from the sets of discussions that you often hear in energy circles is that we bring together a team that has both energy and renewable energy background together with peace building and conflict resolution background. And so we've come to look at energy from the perspective of peace building and conflict resolution, and exploring the overlap of energy and energy poverty in global conflict and conflict dynamics. And so we work on trying to leverage climate finance solutions in ways and in geographies that are at risk of conflict or affected by conflict, and thinking about energy solutions and renewable energy in ways that can support peace. We work on two program areas. The first is a research and advocacy program that is really focused on trying to help the United Nations transition its own energy practices. The UN peacekeeping missions and humanitarian missions are overwhelmingly deployed in some of the least electrified countries in the world. And the common practice is to power those operations with diesel generators, usually powered by imported diesel across very long supply chains. And often the UN footprints, these UN missions, end up being the largest consumers and producers of energy in the region where they're situated. And it's not only an expensive and a dirty practice, but it's one that can evolve and change and represents an entry point for introducing renewable energy into fragile settings. And then the second area where we work, which I'll be discussing today, is on innovative finance. And we've developed something called a Peace Renewable Energy Credit to help support renewable energy projects in energy poor, fragile settings. And I'll go into more detail. So we work on, or we've identified 3 overlapping sets of challenges, and that realize that there's very strong overlap in the countries that are at greatest vulnerability of climate impacts, those at greatest risk of conflict, and those with the highest levels of energy poverty. And when I was looking up the numbers for this presentation, I was shocked to see that the latest numbers on global displacement is 1 in 97 humans. So more than 1% of the world population is displaced today. And the international response mechanism, the primary international response mechanism, is really through peacekeeping and humanitarian operations in fragile settings. And those numbers keep ticking up. Every year, the humanitarian aid expenditures has set a new annual record in expenditure, I think every year for the last 5 or 6 years. So it was 28.9 billion in 2018. And when you look at those 3 sets of indices together, we, as I mentioned, we notice very strong overlap between conflict risk, climate vulnerability, and energy poverty, and in fact identified 27 countries that fall into the lowest tier of these 3 indices. So these are the 27 countries that are most affected by climate risk, conflict vulnerability, energy poverty. And it's not to suggest that there's a causal relationship between them, but there is some overlap. And it becomes, I think, even more striking when you look at climate finance flows and where climate finance is going and where it is not going, both what it's flowing into as well as geographic distribution. So renewable energy represents the majority of total global climate finance, and it has for most of the last decade. In some years, it's represented as much as 75% of total climate finance. And annual climate finance has varied between about $350 billion a year to close to $600 billion a year. But the response to climate change, both political and economic, has been to focus on the largest emitters rather than the worst affected. So you see the finance flows going to Europe, North America, China, India, the largest carbon emitting countries. And there's very, very little of these climate finance flows rather going to, for example, these 27 countries or even large parts of the developing world more generally. So only 6% of that total climate finance flow went to Africa and the Middle East combined in 2018. And a fraction of that is going to the affected states that we identified. And so we set out to think about how to address that or how to help mitigate that. And it raised an interesting question. And I think that we come to this again by, from the perspective of peace building and conflict resolution. So these are not necessarily questions that I think an energy first lens leads to, but there's value then in having a broader conversation. So how can renewable energy help support peace building in regions where energy poverty also intersects with climate risk, with climate vulnerability, climate risk, and conflict risk? And we've identified 4 buckets, let's say 4 types of models for where and how renewable energy can help mitigate conflict and help support peace. The first is around the idea of a peace dividend. So I mentioned our work on trying to transition UN operations to renewables. Generally, in the context of a peace agreement, you'll see a big push from governments and international agencies and foreign donors to help front load the immediate benefits. It's called a peace dividend. You want to be able to demonstrate the immediate benefits to the population and politicians and forestall any potential spoilers. So this same logic holds for transitioning UN field missions. You have a chance to pre-position renewable energy assets, essentially, whether that's through peacekeeping missions in South Sudan or Congo or Mali, or humanitarian operations, including refugee camps or internally displaced persons camps. Reducing or mitigating the negative impacts of the reliance on diesel and charcoal. Oftentimes in conflict-affected settings, the supply chains for diesel overlap with war economies. So we've seen this again in South Sudan and Somalia and Syria, where the same humanitarian missions and operations that are supporting life-saving activities are actually procuring their diesel for the generators locally, on the local black market through supply chains controlled by conflict actors. We're starting to see examples of specific energy projects that are designed with conflict dynamics in mind. And the one that we cite here is the Virunga hydro project in Eastern DRC, which is designed to help increase local employment, reduce both poaching in the national park where the hydro project is based, but also reduce some of the economic drivers that are leading young men to join armed groups. And then finally, catalyzing cooperation. We've seen a few examples where the prospect of an energy project itself has led to reopening and renegotiation of local border disputes, for example. And so it's a positive input, which has the opportunity, I think, to be harnessed for peace building benefits. So what is the PERI-URBAN and how did we come up with this? So for those that are not familiar, a REC or renewable energy certificate is a climate finance mechanism. It's a sister mechanism to a carbon credit specifically for renewable energy. And it is designed, it's one of the tools that exists to help offset emissions specifically from energy footprints. And so 1 megawatt hour of clean energy generated represents the environmental attribute of that clean energy generated in the form of a renewable energy certificate. So if I buy a renewable energy certificate from the solar panels on the top of a school, I own the claim to that megawatt hour of clean energy, and I can use that for my carbon accounting purposes. And it is becoming an increasingly important climate finance mechanism. It's a more than $1 billion market globally, but it generally has not yet reached much of the developing world. It has not yet reached most of the countries in our target area. So our goal is to help extend REC mechanisms, and the PERI-URBAN in particular, specifically because we observe that few of the climate finance solutions and the economic incentives that are supporting renewable energy elsewhere are operational and have and exist in the countries or the markets where we are looking. So PERI-URBANs offer a new way to monetize renewable energy from projects in fragile settings. So what is the benefit of the PERI-URBAN? For the developer of a project, it offers a new way to monetize that energy and a second revenue stream. For the buyer, it tends to be corporate sustainability programs, so corporate buyers who are seeking to meet corporate goals, let's say around 70% or 80% or 100% renewable energy usage. And one of the ways that they achieve that is by buying RECs on the market. And there's a trend among corporate buyers to also maximize the impact of their renewable energy purchases. So we see the PERI-URBAN as a way to achieve impact with renewable energy by supporting new projects. And the third is local communities. So the PERI-URBAN projects that we've identified are all providing new electrification as opposed to just greening the grid in previously electrified areas. So this is an example. This is a map of the IREC standard, and IREC is the dominant international standard for renewable energy certificates outside of North America and Europe. And what you see here is that it's a pretty limited market, particularly as you compare it to the 27 countries that we identified. And the countries so looking at Africa, for example, up until 2019, there were only 3 IREC issuing countries that had been authorized in Africa. Over the last 2 years, we've expanded that list to 5, and both DRC and South Sudan have been approved with EPP as the country issuer. And our hope is to continue to extend that architecture and extend the PERI-URBAN marketplace so that corporate procurement can help support projects and help reach new target countries. So we had our first successful PERI-URBAN sale last year, announced at the end of 2020. Microsoft purchased the first PERI-URBANs from a solar mini grid in Eastern Congo in the city of Goma. This was a project developed by Nuru, a local Congolese company, a 1.3 megawatt solar mini grid. And issuing and selling the PRECs provided an additional way for Nauru to generate a revenue stream. And we were able to discuss with Nauru and with Microsoft the goals and the needs of that project. And they consulted the local community in the neighborhood where the mini grid was being built. And the community identified nighttime lighting as a top priority. So Nauru used the revenue from the first sale of that PREC to purchase and install 35 nighttime streetlights. You can see the picture on the bottom is that community at dark prior to the installation of the streetlights. And it's had a significant impact in the Ndosho neighborhood. There's also been a second PREC sale that closed last year, but has not yet been made public. We've developed two models. The first is this community impact model that I just highlighted. So this is a scenario where the core project itself is already financed, and PREC revenue is used to support an additional project. So in the Goma case, it was streetlights. In South Sudan and Malakal, we're looking at using the additional revenue from the core system to help electrify a local hospital and health system. The second model is what we call catalytic capital. And here the idea is for projects that are not yet financed to pre-sell multiple years of PRECs to a corporate buyer in order to help generate up to 10% of capital expenses. And I think one of the things that is important for this conversation about the PREC is that it is the first RECs that we are aware of that are generated from off-grid projects. So we are pushing the boundaries, let's say, on how this traditional carbon accounting climate finance mechanism has been conceived and conceptualized. It's been defined as a mechanism for grid-connected projects up to now. But we know when we talk about energy poverty and energy access, it's the populations who do not have access to the grid where the solutions need to be oriented. So by extending the REC mechanism to be able to support off-grid projects, it's our hope that we will be able to speed up this energy transition in an equitable way. So we are hoping to expand PREC issuance to all 27 of our target countries, and hoping that this will increase both finance flows and more equitable development, but also support peace building and help bridge the gap between renewable energy efforts and peace building and conflict mitigation efforts. So I will stop there and look forward to answer any questions on this.
Dave, I want to thank you for doing that. I mean, I just think that it's such a fascinating example of not only recognizing what clean energy can do in the various settings that you highlighted, that Rebeka highlighted, that Sebastion highlighted, but ultimately doing what we talk about all the time, but don't always do, and that is to make this story not about clean kilowatt hours, clean electrons, but about brand new sorts of services that we can think differently about today. I think that your talk highlighted it. All three talks really got into ways in which the clean energy transition is much broader than the clean energy transition. It's a much different way to think about our interaction with other people, with nature, and with many of the problems that we generally try to do our best to ignore. The issues of food waste are an implicit feature about the food chain to market in Africa. The unwillingness to look at what happens in the slums that Sebastion highlighted. The ways in which we absolutely avert our gaze from refugees, and the number is 1 in 100 people on the planet being refugees, is something that I fear is going to go up as climate change bites more and more, but it's something we should do in the opposite direction of. Each of you kind of highlighted different sorts of solutions. So I'd like to start with one question to each of you, and just to let our audience know that putting your questions in will bring them up for dialogue as well. So feel free to begin to put them up here. But let me ask each of you, I'll go back in the order that people spoke. And the question's really going to be, in addition to what you just said, in terms of the individual efforts, what would be a next thing you would like to see, whether it's a local or a national effort, something that might come out of the UN that could be part of the COP26 meetings in Glasgow in November of this year, or something that we need on the innovation side. So what next would you like to see in terms of a progression? And I'm not assuming that PERI-URBAN entirely works, or that SOLshare goes everywhere, or that the mini grids in Africa become the norm, but what would be a next innovation or a next social dimension that you'd like to see kind of in this conversation in terms of what we need to get to a more sustainable system? So it's broad, but Rebeka, let me start with you in terms of something that you see or would like to think of as on the horizon here.
Thank you so much, Dan, and so great to hear from Sebastion and Dave, both persons whose work I admire so much, both from near and from far. And it's really interesting how all of the talks sort of hit on different but very similar topics. I was here furiously sort of taking my own notes as both of them were speaking. I really enjoyed those talks so much. Dan, I'm going to cheat and give two answers to your question. I hope that's okay. The first answer, the first answer is gonna harp on Sebastion's presentation, and I really think this idea of a different way of doing utilities. And when we think about the word utility, right, what it really means is service. And when we think about different ways of doing energy service, I feel like that's really a frontier that could change the look of the energy future for basically the entire developing world. So I'd really love to see more effort, more concerted effort in these spaces. And then related to that is harmonization of some of our global standards. So we were talking across all three talks, we talked about emission standards, we talked about standards for equipment and technology. And we really, especially on continent here, I can just speak to the African situation. Each country is kind of doing its own thing in terms of what's the limit, what's the age limit for vehicles that are allowed to be imported, or how do we manage e-waste and so on. And so seeing some harmonization at the global level, and the COP, as you mentioned, would be a perfect way to help to drive that, I think would be some critical next steps.
No, that makes perfect sense. So Sebastion, the same question to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think concerted efforts really hits the nail in the sense of when we talk about integrative electricity or electrification planning, or the lacks thereof, that we have the situation that even from the international organizations, that as an example for Bangladesh, the largest international banks would fund the grid extension and mini grids or solar home systems at the same time without requesting any coordination efforts. I mean, this is probably the easiest way. If I'm the person who gives the money, it's probably the easiest way to be able to demand coordination if I give the money to both. So I think we should hold those organizations accountable for it. And because if we get to that, we solve a lot of problems that we put double, triple infrastructures. And often there comes a support, but the people still pay for solutions. And then they end up having bought a solar home system, bought into a diesel grid, and then the national grid comes, they need to bribe someone there to get a connection. Now they have paid 3 times already. And that's not electricity bills, that's just all upfront for inefficiencies. I think this really needs to stop.
I mean, what you say is interesting in the sense of when the first utilities were generated, this was actually the worry. The idea of natural and monopolies was that we didn't want 4 companies sending power lines down the same street. So 150 years later, 140 years later, we're actually dealing with one of the questions that was fundamental to when utilities were started. It's an interesting kind of perspective, and whether that's because the technology has evolved to a point that allows us to think differently, or the institutions, it really highlights to me the degree to which we could be seeing utilities, which many people think of as not, as Rebeka said, as a service generator, but as a one-way communication.
Oh, we might have lost Dan there.
Did we lose Dan? Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe Dave, you want to answer the question?
Yeah, I can take a quick.
Yeah. Dave.
I would focus on, I guess, some of the some of the openings that already exist. So I would go back to a practical shift in practices from UN peacekeeping and humanitarian operations. The sad reality is that most of the crises where humanitarian and peacekeeping missions are deployed are protracted crises with an average lifespan over 15 years. And I think that there's an opportunity to use those footprints. It's more than $35 billion a year in annual expenditure. Energy costs are roughly 5% of that, so more than $1.5 billion a year in diesel generators and diesel just for power. And I think that it creates openings for mini grids or for local projects in often remote settings where the UN can be the catalyst to new investment and new renewable energy development. But it's not really thinking about energy in this way yet. And so I think pushing the missions that already exist, the systems that already exist and are deployed in vulnerable settings to think more creatively, let's say, about energy as a tool for stabilization and peace building, I think has tremendous potential.
I'd agree with that. And it seems that we still don't have Dan back. So perhaps we can go through the questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And then, I don't know, Samira, if you're online, if you'd like to lead us through or moderate opening the floor to your audience.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think we can start with the first Q&A question for now. I have a bunch in case people don't have more questions, but audience, feel free to add in more questions in the Q&A if you have more. But one question here is asking if there are ideas for any other non-conventional energy sources. So I guess each of you can answer that. So I'll add in, so this person asks, energy sources like human waste, biogas plants, and wind energy tapping. But I'll also add in intersections with other energy modes and resources like finance and like the food ag system. So if you could speak more to intersections with other systems and also alternative energy sources, that would be great.
Maybe I'll start with the Samir, with the question from Professor JV from India. In our case, it's solar because that's what was mostly distributed here, what was prevalent in the villages, and we set out with the notion, let's use what's already there, let's build those grids on existing resources, and that were those solar home systems. There are also quite a few biogas plants in Bangladesh, but they're mostly used then for cooking to produce the gas and are not being converted into electricity. So that's a good complement from an energy perspective, but from an electricity perspective, no. In terms of wind, it's a little bit tricky. For the longest time, it was said that there's no wind in Bangladesh. Then they found out maybe the mapping hasn't been done quite right, wasn't maybe not on the right height. And I think also from Dan's team, they did some measurings, and USAID definitely did a new wind mapping, and maybe there's some wind at the coast. So let's see, something is happening. But for us, it's really what is there. And that was solar home systems. If wind comes in there as well, that would be actually good, just from a perspective of generation at night, so that you have a little bit more of a balance there. So in general, we are agnostic to the energy source. It just happened to be solar home systems to be the most abundant around here. Over to you, Dave or Rebecca.
I will leave this one for the people with PhDs in energy to answer.
I will just add into what Sebastion has said that, of course, here in Africa, we see a lot of solar as well, large and small scale hydro. And in particular, I think we're seeing more and more small and meso scale hydro plants coming online. We're seeing a lot of that in Southern Africa, like in Zambia and so on. And then on to answer, you mentioned biogas plants, Prof. JV, and that's an interesting one because I think it's an emerging clean cooking solution. But not only is it addressing a clean cooking problem, it actually helps in other ways as well. Right now, biogas represents about 0.1% of residential cooking solutions in Kenya. So it's not that big, but it's really growing. I think the last time I checked, which would have been late last year, there was something like 21,000 biogas digesters in operation. And they serve for household, they provide basically gas, of course, for household cooking needs. And that gas is based off of the waste of, whether that's farm animals or animals on compound, but also it provides powerful productive use activities on farms. And so it's really, I think, becoming quite interesting as this sort of dual solution that supports cleaner cooking, but also provides farm activity opportunities as well.
Great, thanks. There's another question here. This may be for Dave, but I think you can all jump in. What have you learned from working with RECs that you would recommend governments considering carbon taxing industries?
That's a good question. I think that there are many cases where they're complementary. Again, RECs are specific to the to emissions from electricity. And so they are one of the tools that are used to either reach renewable energy commitments and or offset emissions from energy, but they've also emerged as a key economic stimulant for renewable energy development and renewable energy investment. So I think that they are complementary to a larger carbon taxation initiative. You also have examples of both voluntary REC markets and compliance REC markets in either at a country level or a state or regional level where you have legislation. With a compliance REC market, governments have the ability to put some boundaries on the types of qualifying REC projects, so that can be done in a way that is consistent or complementary to whatever the carbon taxation program is. But I would say that there are a lot of examples where RECs have been used as a complementary tool in the toolkit for supporting broader carbon taxation, carbon accounting goals.
Dave, can I add on that? And it's really a question for all three of you, because one of the parts of the dialogue around moving to more sustainable solutions is integrating in the ability to think about not just the cost of carbon, but the social cost of carbon. And from relief camps to investing in the poorest communities where Sebastion's working, to finding ways to support farmers, for example, to get into sustainable biodiesel, as Rebeka mentioned. All of these are really methods to broaden the economic lens on sustainability questions. And I'm kind of wondering for each of you, and Dave, you've tried it directly with getting organizations to fund directly based on this credit. Do you think we need to move to kind of one or a few standards, i.e. a global price of carbon, a global social cost of carbon? Because we have experts arguing both sides, saying these should be done individually, region by region. Others saying we really won't get the big international organizations to work together unless they kind of see this as a standard currency. Let me start in a different order. So Sebastion, anything on this kind of issue of the local versus the global on the pricing aspects of sustainability?
I'm really not an expert on this, Dan. You're calling me out here.
Not trying to, sorry.
This is even so, being an economist, this is not something I have looked at. So I would just pass the baton before to Rebeka. Maybe you're smarter on that one.
Thanks, Sebastion. Dan, I know that the literature is quite split. It's a great point that you brought up. And it's split sort of down the middle on this. I tend to fall into the latter camp in terms of globalization of carbon markets. Because what I see here, drawing on experience from the Caribbean as well as Southeast Asia and now here in Africa, I think that oftentimes governments are looking to an established global mechanism to leverage. And I think that without global mechanisms, we have challenges around redundancy, we have challenges around leakage, around attribution, et cetera, et cetera. So I tend to lean that way, although of course I understand, and we've seen, you know, for instance, the way that the carbon market played out in early days in California, why there also needs to be some sovereignty around the way that those prices are set. So I don't know if that's helping, but I think that there are arguments on both sides. I tend to lean the latter.
Yeah. No, I think it really is helping, and it's a hard question, because on the one hand, we see the markets for flowers in Europe driving rural investment and some rural poverty in East Africa, which become, you know, a huge hub of exporting flowers. On the other hand, just what you said is also the case. We see big organizations, the government of Denmark, Unilever, have said publicly that to be able to invest more in groups like SOLshare, in groups like farmers cooperatives in Kenya, to put money into things like PERI-URBAN, although they were actually talking about a health version when they made this, they were concerned that too much fragmentation meant that they, as big global citizens, would not see this as a lead area. And I think each of your talks really illustrated the critical need to think very locally about solutions and how they support or impact individuals, but also the degree to which we ultimately need to move much faster. And we may not like it, and some of our audience, you all may disagree, but one of the features that I feel moving faster means is making it easier to move financial resources into sustainability solutions. And so I worry a little bit that great experiments that are fragmented are a good start, but they may not get us there. But Dave, you've talked about this directly, from building the Nuru project in Goma to actually trying to get the UN and others on board. So I'd love to hear how you see this, you know, local versus global challenge playing out.
I think that what I've observed with our work with the PERI-URBAN is that the climate finance mechanisms that we've been looking at really struggle to either function or reach and scale fragile states. Defined as, let's say, the most vulnerable, most energy poor, the regions and countries where it could have the greatest impact. It's certainly true for RECs. Not only is the REC issuing architecture not reaching those places, as I mentioned, but the rules of the game for REC accounting, REC retirement were built and developed based on Europe and North America. So they're defined as, at its core, a grid-connected project. But we want to use this, and we should be using this or thinking about how to use this as a mechanism to extend grids or extend electrification through decentralized projects. And so we've been trying to fight that fight with different standards groups or individual buyers. And there's openness to it, but it's not a conversation that folks in that system have given much thought to, because they're addressing a different problem. I think that there's a similar critique with carbon credits, frankly. If you look at the CDM and compare the 27 countries on our list with CDM projects, many of them have 1, 2, 5 CDM registered projects. Of the 9,000 registered CDM projects, there are very few in fragile states. So I would argue that it's not necessarily a relaxation of, it's an adaptation of some of the mechanisms that is probably required to help make them work and help make them function for countries that may not have the same state capacity that exist in other nations that are that are embracing those mechanisms and benefiting from those mechanisms, whether states or corporations. But I think the goal is to figure out how to extend them to most vulnerable, those that are currently at the bottom, struggling with kind of these overlapping threats. Then there needs to be a rethinking of both the rules of the game and how they apply in order to reach the populations that I think where they could have the greatest impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is I'm glad each of you answered the way you did. I mean, I think this is tricky. There is not expert consensus, not that expert actually needs to matter, but there isn't there isn't a consensus on which mechanisms here will work best. And so having enough diversity in the experiments and trials is a key part of the story. I want to change the focus topic a little bit to ask everyone a question here about gender. And each of the projects we've talked about have a very clear relationship to power dynamics within communities, power dynamics at the larger level, and the microeconomics both within communities and households. And I'd love for each of you to kind of reflect a bit on what you've seen as the lessons in terms of how the efforts you're doing have either helped to expose challenges along gender lines in communities or in financing, or have really led to kind of the uplifting lessons on gender equity and empowerment that we talk about all the time internationally. In every course that talks about energy and climate justice or development always has a segment on it. And I find some of them are great, but some of them are a little bit kind of repeating the words without substance. So I'd love for each of you to reflect a little bit on how you see your efforts in this area. And so Sebastion, let me start with you.
Yeah, I'll do this one. I'll take
Dave, what's that?
This one I will take.
I kind of figured so.
No, let me maybe tell a quick story which really surprised me. If you look at Bangladesh, it's a garments market. So there are 3 million women working in garments in Dhaka and the surrounding metropolitan area, 3 million. Now, when COVID hit and the Western world wasn't buying that much clothes anymore because they were closing down everything, obviously a lot of those women lost their jobs and they were going back to their villages. So we had the idea and also support that why don't we give those women a solar powered sewing machine when they go back to their villages, because they know how to sew. They're doing this here. They lost their job. So, and also add on to that and then buy the clothes and set up the value chain. So then I said to the team, that shouldn't be too hard, right? So let's go to all our grids, 30, 40 grids, and let's see. And then they came back and said, yeah, in every grid, there are 6, 7 shops for sewing, but there are no women. I said, what do you mean there are no women? In Dhaka, it's full. The streets are full at 6 p.m. There are only women who came from the job. No, that's in Dhaka. But in the villages, the women are not in the marketplace. They are not sewing. And if they're sewing, they're somewhere hidden in the house. We can't find them. So that's really astonishing because it shows this huge discrepancy. I was like, and the donor said, Sebastion, why aren't you working? And I'm like, we can't find the women. And so I think one really has to look close and deeper, and then because that meant for everybody thought, okay, the sewing in Bangladesh is only done by women, but that's only true for the big houses here in Dhaka and around. It's not true for the villages. But looking at deeper, also in the villages they do that, but they do it at home and they do it in a more privatized setting. They don't do it, exposed in the marketplace where you usually see those shops. And that's something I think where we have to chime in. What we did is that we did a couple of projects now where we said, okay, look, we earmark certain supports to women. The way we can do that, we know where the phone is registered and the phone is connected to the meter we have. So we can give really support directly onto the phone of the women. Whether they are allowed to keep that money then, we cannot guarantee, obviously. It's the same with microfinance. Often we saw the women getting the money and then the husband was standing around the corner and picking it up because they knew in the Grameen Bank you would only get it in the women group, right? So from our side, obviously we can do step 1. Whether step 2 then also materializes is to be seen. But I think a lot more and a lot deeper. My realization now in this COVID crisis, when this was, and the donor said, do it with the sewing machines, and we didn't find the women. It was just for me like, yeah, it's not that easy, right? You need to go really close. You need to really look through it and see the dynamics, and they change also.
Really interesting. Thanks for that one. Dave? think you might still be on mute, but you work in areas where gender violence is critical. So love to get the energy piece perspective.
I think the story, I guess, that comes to mind, our projects come to us from a couple different, the PERI projects from a couple different starting points. And the most common is that it comes from a renewable energy developer who already has a project or is working on a project. But in a few cases, we have partnered directly with peace building organizations in South Sudan to develop a project concept. And what I find interesting about that experience is that the starting point is not kind of the economics of the solar mini grid or the anchor client. The starting point is the local conflict dynamics where they're already working, and then thinking about, okay, from a peace building or conflict mitigation perspective, how would an energy project be able to assist? How would it be able to support what we're already doing? And there have been two different examples working with two different groups in different parts of the country where the lead idea was to use energy to support a local level. Essentially, they were called different variations of a women's peace building or peacekeeping team. One was in an internally displaced persons camp. One was in a contested area between Sudan and South Sudan, where local peace building initiatives had brought together or were supporting pre-existing groups of cross-line women who were trying to monitor, verify, build trust within the communities and provide some kind of peace building component. And the idea of integrating joint management of an energy system and being the kind of oversight for what would be a joint and shared service, I think is a really powerful idea. And it's, I think, quite telling that both of these examples ended up identifying the women's peace building team as what they determined to be the most trusted, the most responsible, the greatest upside for linking this with a joint energy project. And in both cases, they're both still concepts. They haven't been built. One of them is engaging with the UN in an area called Abyei. But I think that it shows, hopefully next time that we have this conversation, I'll be able to report back on the actual construction of the project. But I think there's tremendous promise to think about how to, again, integrate a gender-driven peace building with energy and with control of energy, because in many of the settings where we're working, women are the most vulnerable population when it gets, whether that's for collection of firewood or at nighttime when it's dark. And so I guess the opportunity is there, and hopefully we have a growing number of examples that we can point to in the future for how this can really help. Integration of energy can really help to extend the potential benefits.
Yeah. So, I mean, the last thing I want to even suggest is romanticizing the gender component. But in the, you mentioned your work in the Virunga area. One of the dialogues that we've seen taking place among the different tribal groups who are all kind of vying for power has been that it has been easier to launch and to sustain conversations among women market leaders and others than it has been to the former combatants. And whether that's because the women are twice disempowered, so I mean, there's a lot of ways you can look at it, but there is certainly, there is more than anecdotal data that this is sometimes an easier platform to talk about infrastructure, investment, et cetera. But again, I don't want to overreach it, but I just want to highlight it. So Rebeka, I intentionally got this one. Do we come to you as the final of the three on the gender component here? But I know you have a fair amount to say on this. And so
I have a lot to say on this one, yes. But just as you said, we can move past the anecdotal data now. A study that we did last year, we published, and a follow-up is coming out this year, was on jobs and the connection between energy access and jobs creation, both working directly, of course, with some of the kinds of companies that we're talking about, the SOLshares and so on, but also job creation through having access to energy and what that allows you to then do. With the study, we found that decentralized renewables, so the kinds that we're talking about in this conversation so far, the solar home systems, lanterns, mini grids, productive use appliances down the line, are actually producing, if you look at Kenya, Nigeria, and India, just as sort of indicative markets, these types of technologies are actually producing or creating or demanding about as many jobs as their respective utility sectors in their respective countries. So that's saying a lot for such a young and nascent sector. But just to take that a step further, if we look at the characteristics of these jobs, we're finding that they are tending to be more skilled than the broader renewable energy sector. They tend to be longer lasting, so longer retention periods for a year plus. So the average is actually 30 months. And they tend to be higher compensating. So all of that sounds really fantastic for the young population that we're seeing here sort of booming, because of course, as we all know, the lack of livelihood opportunities leads to conflict, leads to the vulnerabilities that we're all discussing. Where we're seeing some interesting things is on the gender side, in terms of gender participation. On average, we found that women were actually only making up about a quarter of direct jobs through decentralized renewables, which is about comparable with the global renewable energy sector, where it's about 1 in 3. But the percentage of women in leadership roles was even lower, about 1 in 4 senior managers or less. And what we were finding was interesting was that when you look at the informal side, so not working formally with these companies, but informally through sales, etc., then the number shoots up to 60%. So what that showed us, and when we talk with companies, is what you hear, is that there's a clear value proposition for women in the workforce and for women as part of this value chain for renewables and decentralized renewables in particular. They are sort of the fabric of communities. And so that's where, if you don't have women as part of your sales force and leading your sales force, it will definitely adversely affect your sales. And so I think companies recognize that, and they actually are saying that they want more women's participation in the sector, but they're challenged by things like business culture, recruitment practices, skills development, the challenge of getting training out into rural areas where rural women are. And so I think all of that to say that there's a really fundamental opportunity here for growing and expanding the opportunities for women here, not just as end users, but as directly involved in the transition and in these technologies themselves. But we really have a lot to do, not so much on the technology side, but as you started out by saying, it's more on the social side. And if we can solve some of these challenges around recruitment and training and culture, then there's a major opportunity for enhanced women's participation.
No, I think this is really key. And this is just an interesting aspect of how we can start to think differently about community infrastructure, about investments, about the training programs that are involved. And so let me turn to that next. I know that training, capacity building gets used and overused a lot, but for each of the project areas you're invested in, what have been some of those kind of lessons and key features? I'm sort of struck by the degree when Sebastion is showing the SOLshare boxes with the little grid diagram on the side, that there is a level of need to understand how technology and justice and microeconomics all play into the use of these things. We have examples that mini grids, for a long time, people loved the idea, but couldn't find good market opportunities. Now we can see this in these reconstruction areas. And Rebeka highlighted, again, I think something that we often mention and then look beyond very quickly, and that is that agriculture and food is in many ways our biggest connection to the planet for many people, particularly urban residents who kind of think you go to the local Duka or shop or Safeway or Piggly Wiggly or whatever the store in your area might be, and we just don't think about the product flows. And yet they're not just about food, they're about energy, they're about money, they're about what we could do better on the waste side. So in terms of training, either within your organizations or trainings you've been involved with, what are best or worst practices? But I tend to focus on the best practice side. What has advanced the conversation? Let me jump around. Dave, let me start with you on this one. Then I'll go Sebastion and then Rebeka.
I would say actually that our observation is that there are very few trainings happening in the renewable energy space, specifically in the countries that we've been working in so far. A couple of years ago, we helped organize with Rebeka's assistance, actually, and her colleagues at Strathmore, what was then the first ever solar training in South Sudan. South Sudan is either the least electrified or second to least electrified country in the world, depending on which data site you're looking at. And even though you have a $2.5 billion a year peacekeeping mission, humanitarian operation, all burning imported diesel, there had never been resources devoted to organizing local renewable energy training before. And the turnout was overwhelming. The interest was overwhelming. The Minister of Energy himself showed up. Anecdotally, when we've had similar exploratory conversations in Congo, from what we understand, there's never been a solar training that's been held in the DRC. There's been one held in Mali. It's never happened in Central African Republic. So I think I can't speak for all of our 27 countries, but those that we've been looking at so far, I think that there's low-hanging fruit. There's tremendous opportunity to link capacity building and training in order to maximize the local pickup and local benefit of renewable energy investment with the other kinds of things that we're talking about, and making sure that the benefits are all not being captured by, let's say, an international company that is maybe coming in and building the system or designing the system, but also a local cadre and local training corps that can build and grow and sustain and expand those benefits.
Fantastic. Okay. Sebastion?
Yeah, I mean, you already touched a little bit upon it, Dan. It can get incredibly complex. I think if we look at the West, and when a net metering or a feed-in tariff came, most of the people in the beginning didn't believe that they would actually get money. Now, obviously, there was no difference here, even probably it was more so. So you have to imagine you go to a village and people who were deprived of energy, you tell them now that you can even earn money with energy. Intuitively, that doesn't make any sense to them because they're deprived of energy. So when we went out at first, and it took us quite some time to understand this, and we said, hey, you can earn money from the sun. They were saying, yeah, and I need more power. I don't want to earn money from the sun. And I was like, what do you mean you don't want to earn money? So that was an incredible value proposition thought of from a very different context and perspective. So what we changed, that was like when we had the community sitting together, we were saying, okay, look, what are things you always wanted to do in terms of appliances, but you never could? And then people said, oh yeah, I had a baby, I would like to have a fan, but when I bought my solar home system, I didn't tell them that, and now it's too small for a fan. That changed everything. So now with the box, you become more flexible and you can just buy on the go what you additionally need for this fan. The notion of selling comes much later. People need to get a hang on it. But the moment the richest person in town doesn't have the highest balance on his meter, he starts calling us, hang on, why does he have more money on his meter than I have? I'm the richest man in town. We said, well, you said you only want to buy. Huh, okay, now I get it. So it takes a long time. And now imagine that we actually don't do this B2C, we do it B2B, which means we work with the organizations together who installed those 6 million solar homes. And so we have to tell them, and then they in turn again have to tell the end user. So it took us years to get the SOPs in place, to get those training of trainer concepts together. It wasn't an easy undertaking. And we had occasions where we did a training for the installation of the grid, and then the new partner said, we are all done, the grid is installed. And then we looked, and then he put 20 batteries into one house and all panels onto one roof, because that's how he knew a mini grid. He didn't understand the peer-to-peer, the decentralized. So he collected basically the solar home system from the people and put them all into one house. And we were like, what has happened here? So I think in order to be able to scale, standardization is extremely important. And also, of course, we had to learn our business model was too complex. We had to simplify it, otherwise we'll not be able to get this across. But it took us, I think, too long to learn. So I would be happy to hear to hear about some good tips to shortcuts to to avoid all those mishaps along the journey.
Well, for that, I'll pass it to you, Rebeka, because you've done a huge number of trainings and have been involved in a range from Strathmore to Power for All. And so I'd love to get your perspective on how can this process, work best? What have been the features about training engagement that have really stood out to you?
Sure. Let me talk a little bit about what we're seeing, both from the trainings that we do actually implement locally, but what we're hearing from companies themselves as well, which, as I mentioned, was through an extensive survey that we did last year. Training, as you said, Dan, can often be an overused phrase. We sometimes, sort of talk about it in amorphous terms, but what companies are saying is a couple of things. One, that they're actually, at least in some markets, like here in Kenya, are a number of on-paper qualified persons that come out with, whether it's a diploma, associates, even university degrees. So a slew of higher education certifications are there on the market. What they're saying is really the challenge is the general business soft skills, which are critically lacking, and that affects every area and aspect of company performance. So these include leadership, finance, strategic planning, communication, chain of command, project management, compliance, anti-harassment, health and safety, things that we sort of think of as second nature. These soft skills are not part of the current curricula to energy relevant programs. And so often companies are saying, great on paper, but really not workplace ready. So one big challenge is helping to solve or address rather this soft skills need, so that young graduates come out of their training programs or higher education programs ready to directly enter the workforce. Secondly, is that link of directly entering the workforce. What you hear as well is that there aren't enough recruitment programs or recruitment pipelines. And we hear this as well from the students. They spend a lot of money going to school or getting training, getting certified. And then once they're finished, there isn't really an on-ramp into the working world. And so again, this sounds like a very banal problem, but these are some of the very day-to-day things that are sort of holding back progress in terms of bringing a local workforce that's ready and capable into these kinds of companies. And the third I would just say is that we hear a lot of the job opportunities are actually in the rural communities, of course, where the decentralized technology is being deployed, which is a big difference, as Dave keeps saying, between utility scale and decentralized. And we don't really have very many training programs that cater to these kinds of communities, to rural communities. So one opportunity here that companies have brought up could be certification of those that already have skills. You've got your local technician, you've got your local electrician, your local folks that actually already know what to do, but don't have the piece of paper next to their name. And so simple things like these could actually help to transform the entire way that we think about workforce development. And again, I know, as you said, training can be sort of an overused phrase, but I really do think it's important, and that we have to actually hold the financiers and the donors to account on this, because really this is not about just creating jobs for jobs' sake, but this is also helping to localize the ownership of the technology solutions. Just anecdotally, if you think about the way that COVID relief funding came into the energy space over the course of 2020, a recent report that was put out by Gogla found that over 70% of funding that came in as COVID relief for Sub-Saharan Africa went to 3 international companies, 3, which left the entire local sector completely sort of, on a limb. And so I think helping to localize the solutions, localize the workforce, is really also comes down to a justice and equity and inclusion issue as well.
Yeah, and I think this is really so critical, because in kind of this hopeful moment, this is the inauguration of the Biden-Harris team in the United States today, who are going to unleash a whole set of pro-climate, pro-justice activities starting today, from canceling controversial pipelines, fossil fuels from Canada, to rejoining the Paris Climate Accord today, to working closely with the UK government on initiatives for COP26 to come up in Glasgow in November. There's going to be a real push to move ideas and money out the door quickly. And if one doesn't pay attention to the kind of things that you just highlighted, Rebeka, you do tend to get the new resources being dumped on the existing organizations. And I hate to call someone out, but Jeff Bezos gave $10 billion in tranches, and the first two tranches, almost $1 billion each, went to only existing known quote unquote safe organizations. I'm not saying it wasn't a good investment, but it didn't broaden the conversation. It didn't bring in the marginalized groups. I think it's good for what it's done, but clearly we need to do a lot more. So last question of our session, I'm going to start it off, but then I'm going to ask and put someone on the spot here, and that's going to be Samira Siddiqui, who's a graduate student here at Berkeley, but works very closely with ICAD in Bangladesh and beyond to look at solutions for stateless people. And so I just want to thank her for doing so much work to set this up, and to call her out a bit, because her question is one that really brings a lot of things we've been talking about to the people who we most avoid in these conversations. And yes, it's the poor, and yes, it's women, and yes, it's underrepresented minority tribal groups. But as a class, it is the people that Dave Mozersky highlighted, and that is people who live between states or states that deny their rights are, in some sense, our collective growing climate and political problem. We expect more and more internal and international refugees. We expect larger damage in these areas from climate change. The most vulnerable ecologically are often the most vulnerable political areas. And so, and I'm going to turn it to Samira, ask her to unmute herself, and just ask her to ask a final question for each of you, really focused on how can one engage in those kind of communities at most risk between states and statelessness. So Samira.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all the panelists. This has been a really fantastic conversation. So thanks again so much for your time. That's my question, as Dan has alluded to, it's in the chat, but it's more of a political economy question. I'm curious how you each think about partnering with local communities, whether they're rural communities or stateless populations in Dave's case, as well as local government and NGOs, to increase the capabilities, I guess, that these communities have in actually using the energy access that we've been talking about this whole time. Like, there's so much we can talk about in terms of increasing energy flow and access to resources, but how do we actually aid in these communities actually being able to use them politically and in the long term?
I can take a first cut at that. Oh, do you want to go ahead, Rebeka?
Go for it, Dave. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go. I think it's an excellent question, Samira, and I don't know that there's a sort of a single policy or single answer. I would repeat two things that I think I've said before. The first is, I mean, from our side, we work through partners, but the first is a need to mainstream the idea of energy as part of the toolkit for working with vulnerable populations, whether that's humanitarian organizations or otherwise, or local organizations. But I think that there's a lot of work still to be done to raise awareness and get organizations on the humanitarian side who have a pre-existing and tried and true toolkit for operations, and energy isn't part of that. Energy, I mean, you're starting to see some movement around the idea of humanitarian energy, but it's still largely focused on humanitarian operations themselves. And so I think pushing the boundary a little bit further to also think about energy as a solution for the target populations where these operations are, and that includes training, that includes capacity building, that includes services, is an area for growth, but one where I think it's still pretty early days. The second point I would make, and again, I'm repeating myself, is that I think it's a slightly different problem that requires different solutions than the solutions that we already have. If you look at where, I made the point with regard to carbon credits and RECs, and that we need to adapt the systems to reach fragile states. I think the same is true for even within a country, where what projects are being funded and how are those being identified, that it tends to be that it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the most attractive projects with the best economics, whether that's by region in terms of renewable energy investment. If you look at Africa, flowing to Kenya and Ghana and South Africa and Uganda. So if your goal is to instead target vulnerable populations or countries that are less stable and less attractive investment settings than Kenya, I think that you need to come at it from a slightly different angle. Thank you.
Let me go to Rebeka next. So the last word in our session will be from Sebastion, who is in country with Gobeshona as hosted. So Rebeka, your thoughts on the stateless person dialogue that Samira is highlighting.
Thanks for the question, Samira. On the topic of partnerships and building political capabilities, I think that it's a really great topic. And for me personally, I've made working in partnership with local and grassroots organizations sort of part and parcel of my career, because I've seen it work so many times before. In fact, Dan, who was my advisor for my PhD work, and knows this story so well, we're working for years in Borneo, Southeast Asia, with local grassroots organizations looking at alternatives to large-scale hydropower. And we published a lot of fantastic papers that demonstrated what those alternatives could look like and how they could be implemented. But it wasn't the papers that had any real major impact. It was that knowledge in the hands of local community groups that they then were able to communicate as they needed to their constituents, whether that's through videos circulated on Facebook, news press releases, radio shows. We did all manner of things in collaboration with these various local grassroots organizations, and actually saw a change, right? We actually saw the next slate dam pulled off the slate, and now that entire area is being turned into a protected forest reserve. So for me, it's very, very personal. I think that there's this direct tie between science, knowledge, communication, and I think that the more that we're able to work directly with local grassroots organizations, the better, because it's that really drives the change. And I think this is kind of related to the last question that Dan asked as well, because thinking about localization is important from a technical point of view, of course, as we mentioned, for these companies. It's important from a finance and distribution point of view, as Dan brought up. It's important from an equity point of view, but it's also political. And so I think absolutely partnership is key.
Sebastion, last comments in the panel, in the session come from you, since you are there where Gobeshona has started. So again, what's your perspective on how we might do this?
Well, I mean, I'm building a little bit on what Dave said. I think a fundamental problem is that when you think about energy infrastructure, you always think about something permanent. And now often these settlements are considered non-permanent, or at least the host state hopes that they are non-permanent because it's a crisis and everybody wants to get rid of a crisis, like of an emergency. So by definition, you don't want those to continue those states. But I'm sorry, Samira, I'm stealing from your research. It happens to be that those camps on average are getting quite old. Like I think 12 years, Samira, correct me if I say something wrong, 12 years on average. That's far from non-permanent. And now speaking here from Bangladesh with the Rohingya refugee crisis, it was even more so because it was the strong desire from day one on from the government of Bangladesh that the Rohingya refugees should go back. And until the point that they were actually considered refugees, that also took quite a while. And before that, none of the UN organizations could effectively do anything about it because they didn't have the legal state of a refugee. So energy was not on the agenda here either. The good news is Filippo Grandi, the head of the UNHCR, I don't think they head, right? What is the correct, the High Commissioner, sorry about that, the High Commissioner for them, explicitly included all refugee settlement and host communities in the SDG 7.1, calling for their sustainable access to energy by 2030. So they're explicitly included. That broadens the mandate. I mean, it shouldn't be broadened. It, by definition, for all means actually for all, but he explicitly put it in. And we see quite something happening from UNHCR side. We are building the first peer-to-peer grids now in the camps. What is special about them? They are not allowed to have money here, which may sound weird, but it's a fact. So we needed to come up with a, with a new currency, which would be then energy credits, so that the people can still exchange electricity and have an incentive to do so. So we'll see how we go about that. And on Sunday at 10 Bangladesh time, we have actually a panel on this, energy resilience in refugee camps. Samira will be on that panel. So for those of you listening now, if you check out the agenda on Sunday at 10 Bangladesh time, we have a dedicated session only on this topic. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Well, thank you all. And again, I want to thank the panelists. I mean, I thought this was a really interesting conversation. I feel like we got into a lot more of the details. I want to thank the organizers at ICAD and Gobeshona team for doing this, and really Samira for pulling everyone together. Panelists, thank you, but audience, I really appreciate the range of comments and discussion. I want to encourage everyone to go to other sessions in the Gobeshona global round the clock, round the world process. It's critical to get these conversations up and running, to both highlight what's going on well, what are the challenges, but also to bring more of these ideas to what I'm hoping is an increasing set of governments that are really interested now to push forward these ideas, both through the COP process and through their own aid efforts. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for people staying up incredibly late at night from Kuala Lumpur and elsewhere. Appreciate, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Dave.
Dan.
Thanks all. Very good.